Hello everyone and welcome to Module 3 Common Data Management Documents Part 2. This lecture is going to focus on edit checks. We touched on them briefly in the Part 1 lecture, but we're going to go into a deep dive on them in this lecture. In the Part 1 lecture, we touched briefly on edit checks and the edit check specification. But edit checks are a critical part of the data review process, and therefore they deserve an in-depth discussion of their purpose and importance, how they complement risk-based monitoring, the various types of checks, and the way we're going to use them in REDCap. We're also going to be touching on version control and testing. What's the purpose of an edit check and why are they important? Well, edit checks are the primary tool for data review, and data review is a key value-added aspect of data management. It would be relatively easy to just bang the data into a database and hope for the best, but we know from experience this results in a database with missing and inconsistent data, and that impacts the accuracy of our analysis. Data review provides an opportunity to clean up dirty data and to identify potential problems with the conduct of the trial. Having a formal data review or edit check document ensures that everyone reviewing the data will follow the same procedures and policies, which ensures consistency within the data. A formal data review plan also increases the efficiency of the review process. Each person using that edit check document knows exactly which checks need to be done and how to handle the discrepancies that they find. Used proactively, the edit check results can also identify trends in the data that we may be able to address or avoid by modifying the case report form, the protocol, or training site staff. The image on the slide is a screenshot of the edit check specifications we'll be using in our course. You can see these are fairly simple. I identify the form we're reviewing, the fields on that form, the other forms that we'll be cross-checking with if necessary, what the check is for, and what type of check it is. In this case, it can be a manual check, a default check in the REDCap system, or a custom check that I programmed in REDCap. What does risk-based monitoring have to do with data management edit checks? A lot. Risk-based monitoring encourages the use of centralized monitoring. Centralized monitoring simply means the monitor does some of their monitoring remotely from a central location rather than physically at the site. The best way to accomplish this is to utilize programmatic checks of the data to identify problems and trends. The text in black is taken from the FDA guidance on RBM and outlines some of the ways the FDA suggests centralized monitoring can occur. For many organizations, the data review or edit check programs will be the best place to incorporate many aspects of risk-based monitoring. Regardless of who performs the RBM checks, data management, or CRAs, the important thing is to ensure the edit checks are designed to support RBM. Don't forget, read the entire guidance on risk-based monitoring. Where do you start when you're creating a set of edit checks, and how do you know what the scope and content should be? Well, you start with the edit check specification document. This is the document that outlines what checks need to be done and what tools will be used to do them. How do we know what checks need to be done? Well, we go back to the protocol, the contract, and the analysis plan. Remember, all data management activities should support the goals of the protocol and the analysis plan. Another good place to start is the contract or scope of work. You need to make sure somebody is reviewing the key or critical variables, but that someone may not be you. Sometimes the sponsor will be handling aspects of the review themselves, or they might give that responsibility to a third-party vendor. Your job is to make sure you know what review needs to be done, and that somebody is doing it, and that you've documented who is doing it. Try not to duplicate the efforts of a sponsor, another vendor, or another department. I can't overemphasize the importance of the analysis plan. The A plan will tell you what data is key or critical. You'll focus your efforts on ensuring this data is accurate and that it's in a format that supports the analysis. Try to have someone from Biostats provide input on the data review plan or edit checks. And if that's not possible, try to review the analysis plan itself so that you are thinking about it as you write your edit checks. Your edit checks should also support risk-based monitoring. In her blog, The Top 5 Barriers to Risk-Based Monitoring, Emma Banks points out how hard it can be to resist checking everything when she asks, "Can we only review key data?" Tell a data manager not to check something, and it's the first thing they'll do. It's in their genes, but if the technology can help, we might get there quicker. So this is a good point. Resist the impulse to check everything. Try to focus on what's critical. And remember, you need to do a cross-functional risk assessment. We've touched on this before, but it bears repeating. Try to develop your edit checks and your other project documents using a cross-functional approach to risk assessment. That simply means getting input from people in other functional areas. So get input from clinical and biostats when you're trying to decide which checks to perform and the best manner to perform them in, whether they'll be manual or programmatic, whether they'll be done within the database or external to it, say in SaaS software. You're going to hear me talk about version control a lot because it's important. Remember, identify each new version of your edit checks. Make sure you archive a copy of each superseded or outdated version. Ensure all your team members are working for the most recent version. And keep in mind, some organizations require that each version contain the name of the author and or editor. Furthermore, some organizations require that a senior staff member sign off on a document before it goes into effect, or perhaps a sponsor. This Memorial Healthcare System SOP notes which version is superseded, and it displays 2 of their required approval signatures. What's important is that you find out the standard operating procedure for the company that you're working in, and that you follow it. After you've written your edit checks, you have to test them to make sure they work. You want to make sure your edit checks catch discrepancies that meet the check criteria, in other words, that they flag dirty data. But remember, it's equally important to ensure your checks aren't flagging data that's actually clean. Why? Well, you don't want to generate a query on data that's actually correct. The best way to look for both of these cases is to enter mock patient data that's both dirty and clean. The dirty data contains discrepancies, but the clean data follows the protocol. You should have the dirty data flag out, and the clean data should not. And of course, I want you to document what test data you're using. When I was writing the edit checks for our mock trial, I added a column into my specifications document that noted what test data I would use. I then transferred those test cases to a mock case report form and retained copies of both so I'd remember what I did. Documentation again. Our mock trial will never be audited, but creating and maintaining these documents helped me create a working system. We get so focused on needing documentation as a regulatory requirement, we sometimes forget that we're actually creating it because it helps us do our job better. Prashka discusses the various types of edit checks in depth, so I won't spend a lot of time discussing them here. You can read that in the text. But I will touch on them briefly in the slide and then show you some examples we'll actually be using in our mock trial. Generally, the data review or edit check process uses either manual or programmatic checks. Manual review or checks simply means a person actually looks at the data, the CRF, and or the source document and looks for errors. Programmatic review or checking means an algorithm has been programmed within or outside of the database to look for errors. These errors may be missing values, values that are out of the expected range of responses, or logical inconsistencies. You say the patient missed the visit, but you've entered data for the visit anyway. Or checks between forms. For example, the ConMed form says you have an adverse event, but there's no adverse event entered. Many CDM systems are going to allow you to write simple edit checks within the software. REDCap does this, but sometimes you need to write a more complex check. These types of checks are usually programmed outside of your CDMS system. For example, they might be written in what we call SAS, which stands for Statistical Analysis Software, and they might be run on the data after it's been exported from the CDMS system into SAS datasets. These are called external programmatic checks. The REDCap database we'll be using for our mock trial allows us to do both manual and programmatic checks. So REDCap supports the uploading and viewing of files, particularly of PDF files. We'll use this feature for mock informed consent and CRF source documents. REDCap will also allow us to use programmatic checks. REDCap comes with a set of default edit checks. These are written to cover very common generic occurrences of missing or inconsistent data, and they come with the system. In addition, REDCap allows us to program simple custom-made edit checks, and we'll be using these as well. The REDCap data quality application will function as our edit check program. On the left is a shot of the edit check execution menu. The checks in red are default checks, and the checks in black are custom checks that I wrote. You can also designate checks for real-time execution, which simply means those checks flag a warning to the data entry operator at the point of entry. These are identified by the green dot. Checks without a dot will only be run if you specifically click execute. On the right, you can see the edit check output for a patient who weighed less than 100 pounds. In our REDCap database, we use the informed consent form to use examples of different types of these checks. So you can see in this document that for the C-Common Identifiers form, where you entered your patient ID, I don't have any checks that I'm requiring. There will be some REDCap default checks for missing data, but other than that, we're not doing any checking. However, for informed consent, we are doing some checking. For the date fields, we're checking that against demography, and we want to make sure that the date of the informed consent is prior to the date that we collected the demog data, because that's a GCP requirement. In order to do that check, I had to write a custom program to perform it. I could not use one of the default REDCap checks because they weren't built for that. However, I also wanted to check and make sure the signature and subject ID were present. To do that, I had to check against the source document, and when I checked that source document, again, I looked to see if the signature was there and the ID matched. I couldn't do this programmatically because that data on the source document is not checked in the database. So I had to perform a manual check, and this is part of what you'll do in your Module 7 assignment. We can also use the edit checks to look for protocol deviations. Let's take the inclusion-exclusion criteria, for example. Here, we can use custom program checks to make sure the patient's not pregnant and hasn't used oral contraceptives within the last 90 days. Both of those scenarios would be a violation of the inclusion criteria and therefore would be considered deviations from the protocol. We can also do a manual check of the medical history source documents to scan for unreported oral contraceptive use. All of these would violate the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and therefore, again, would be protocol deviations. Now that we've completed the Part 2 lecture, go ahead and read Proshka's Chapter 4 on edit checks. Also, read the two articles. One is Effective Edit Check Testing, and the other is Tips for Writing Effective Edit Checks in ECRS. And I want you to take a second and scan the Health Decisions Risk-Based Monitoring brochure. They've got some good, it's marketing, but there's still some good information in there about how they're approaching risk-based monitoring and combining it with EDC and data management. For your graded assignment, you have a very quick 10-question open note review of modules 1 through 3. Take care.